friends, and welcome back to my channel, or if you are new here, welcome. My name is Ella and I make weekly videos on Wicca, witchcraft and paganism. So for today's video we have another Wicca related video. So here are my 10 tips if you are a beginner Wiccan. So my first tip is to actually understand what Wicca is and the difference between Wicca and witchcraft. So Wicca is a religion. It's really important for you to understand that and to know the difference between a practice and a religion. With Wicca and it being a religion, there comes devotion. So a lot of people do get this confused, and I see why a lot of the books on Wicca, especially the older ones, do tend to use Wicca and witches interchangeably. So I do have a video on what Wicca is, which can hopefully help you out. I'll link that somewhere on the screen here. But obviously understanding what Wicca actually is obviously important for your journey if you are interested in Wicca. Tip number 2 is read both Wiccan and non-Wiccan books. Just get some different perspectives, a broader understanding of the sphere or the umbrella of witchcraft, paganism. Again, it's just really great to figure out differences between Wicca and different paths, know where you stand, understand what Wicca is, what it's not, and understanding what the different paths entail and how they might be included in Wicca as well. I also think reading books that you might not naturally gravitate towards is actually a really great way to seeing a different perspective, especially in regards to non-Wiccan related books or content. You might be surprised. It's also just good to read different kind of books. I also really suggest reading things like psychology. Anthropology is really a great one. I studied anthropology, so I obviously have to recommend that. Even just books on, like, you know, herbology or minerals, geology, books that are not necessarily witchcraft or Wicca related can really help you out, especially considering it as a nature path, of course. Tip number 3 is to actually really deep dive into the history of Wicca. In case you did not know, it comes from the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which comes from Freemasonry, which is heavily influenced by Hermeticism, and it's just an entire rabbit hole. You would be surprised to see how many influences there are within modern or traditional Wicca. And even just our witchcraft practices in general are really influenced by a lot of these older principles and theories. So deep dive into that, research the history of Wicca. Truly, this does need its own video, so I'm not going to go into that as much here in this video, of course, but it is a really great idea to just kind of see the history of what you are actually practicing. That way you can once again get a broader understanding of what Wicca is and where it came from, how it has shaped itself to what it is today. Tip number 4 is understand that we do not worship our founders. So this is kind of true for both Wicca and Thelemites, for example. The founding figures, let's say, or the most influential figures such as Gerald Gardner, even Raymond Buckland, are not without flaw, and it is a really important thing to note that you can disagree with these people. You are allowed to disagree with their principles. You do not have to worship them, and things change, especially with time. Things don't necessarily age well. So it's actually a really good idea to read their work and then see where you disagree, why do you disagree, and what are the more modern ideas, or what are modern approaches to these things that people have said back then. It's very interesting, because a lot of times Wiccans get a lot of shit for Gerald Gardner, for example. Even Raymond Buckland, even authors such as Silver Ravenwolf have gotten a little bit of, you know, heat in their day. Scott Cunningham is not free from it either. So it's just a really good idea to research these people, why they are not necessarily perfect, let's say, why they have made problematic statements and things like that. So just research that, be aware of it, so that you don't stumble into one of those problems where, you know, you're kind of blind to the issues within the community. In that same tone, tip number 5 is books don't always age well, especially with Wicca. A lot of the books that you see that were written primarily before 2015, I feel like that's kind of when we started shifting. Books before that date, the terminology will not be, it didn't age well necessarily. Like there's a lot of books where, for example, terms like black and white magic were used. We don't use those terms anymore because we now understand that they relate to racial struggles that minorities have gone through. So we do not use those words anymore. You can use, you know, a plethora of other words: positive, negative, baneful magic, malevolent magic. But yeah, there's a couple of words, there's a couple of theories or concepts that we just wouldn't use those words anymore for. You might see in older books things like smudging or spirit animal, you know. Those are words that, or practices that belong to closed practices, cultures or groups of minorities or peoples of minorities, and it's just, we don't use these words anymore, but you still might see them come up in a couple of these older books. And instead of throwing the entire book away, I just want you to be aware of that and read it very consciously. Make sure that you understand why these things are no longer in use, why they didn't age well. I'm sure in, you know, 50 years or 10 years for that matter, books that we have today, you might also have, you know, words that we now use that we won't in the future anymore, because now we don't realize it, but in the future we will hopefully learn and just continue to grow and become more aware of issues like that. And it doesn't necessarily mean that these books are inherently no good. Once again, it just might mean that authors might have just not been aware of that back then, because it wasn't a conversation that really was being held as much as it is today. Tip number 6 is to define magic, what magic actually means to you. One of the frequent things I often see is, if you practice Wicca, do you actually have to practice magic? And it's an interesting one, because on the one hand, I've myself said in older videos, no, you don't have to practice or, you know, do spells, let's say, if you are a Wiccan. And I kind of disagree with myself here. Because now I feel like, because of my definition of magic, I would say magic is inherently tied to Wicca, but because I view a lot of acts as being magical and as being part of an active practice or having an active, you know, ritual, like a daily ritual, that you might not see as magic. So I feel like define what magic actually means to you. That also can really help you figure out what kind of area of Wicca or what kind of style of Wicca you're most interested in. If you are more interested in the more traditional style of Wicca, which is of course very ceremonial heavy, or if you are more interested in the more contemporary style of Wicca, which is more neo-pagan, I would almost say, more nature focused, you know, you have a lot more of that style going on, let's say. So a lot of those kind of definitions, like what is magic, what does magic mean to you, can kind of already like lead you down the path that will help you kind of get started. It's really hard sometimes to get started, so write down these kind of definitions. I suggest writing them down into your journal, Book of Shadows, grimoire, spellbook, whatever you call it. And it's also great to look back on one day, but yeah, write down your definition of magic. Now, jumping off of that same sort of theme, understand that traditional Wicca is not the same as our more contemporary, modern Wicca that you most of the time see online. There still is traditional Wicca, it still exists, and I think it is important that it still exists. But we do have a very interesting, more contemporary, I would call it, style of Wicca nowadays as well, especially if you are on Instagram, on, you know, TikTok, you might see different forms of Wicca than the very ceremonial style. Namely, it is much more neo-pagan, usually a bit more Celtic, and usually more nature focused than necessarily like the more ceremonial style. So understanding that difference is a great thing for you to look into as well, and figuring out what the differences are, what makes these differences, but also what are the similarities, because in the end of the day they both are still Wicca, they're both valid, or the different types of styles of Wicca are, they're valid, you know. So it's an interesting one to also jump into the rabbit hole of, and just go down that path and, you know, researching that. And by researching, what I really mean is read older books, read traditional books on Wicca. I'll leave some in the description box below, and then kind of have your own look at, for example, the hashtag Wicca, or just what you see in more modern books. I'll leave a couple of more modern books in the description box as well, and just kind of compare yourself, what you see, what are the differences, how has it evolved. Tip number 8 is, why are you wanting to join Wicca? What does it mean to you? Why specifically Wicca? Once again, it's important to just figure out what does it do for you, what does it mean to you, why are you choosing Wicca specifically and not traditional witchcraft or, you know, Norse paganism, for example. Like, try to write down once again what Wicca means to you and why specifically Wicca is calling to you, and why does this religion suit you better than another religion, for example. And tip number 9 is, why is Wicca maybe not for you? I have a video on that with a couple of themes that I'm speaking on, but understand that Wicca might not be for you, might not be the right path for you, and that is okay. Doesn't make you a bad person for thinking you want to get into Wicca and then realizing, oh, maybe it's not for you. That's absolutely fine. It's normal. A lot of people go through that. So don't be ashamed if you have that sort of feeling. But yeah, understand why Wicca might not be for you. And I do have a video for that. I'll link it down below. So if you want to go check that out. But yeah, I again suggest you to write these things down and kind of write down the things that you are not entirely happy with, or things that you would like to improve. Because these are things that you can, down the line, kind of take into your own hands even, and kind of make it more of an eclectic Wiccan path, where certain practices might not work for you, so therefore you might want to switch them up a little bit. And I'm not talking about, you know, taking from another culture or taking from another religion or, you know, anything like that. But instead saying, for example, well, I don't really like, you know, the 8 Sabbats, they don't really work for me. I just don't care about Imbolc. Do you really need to celebrate, you know, Lamas, whatever it may be, and write down these things, because you're allowed to change things like that, you know. I mean, you're allowed to create this path for yourself. That's really what a lot of paganism, as an umbrella term, is really kind of what draws a lot of people in, because it is a little bit more personal to you. So tip number 10 is the Wiccan read. Now, the Wiccan read is an interesting one, and I talk about it in my What is Wicca video. I will once again link it. For you to understand that the Wiccan read is it's not gospel. We don't have such a thing as a Bible in Wicca, and I know a lot of people say the Wiccan read is similar to that, but it's not. So research what the Wiccan read is, where it came from, and that it is not what every Wiccan goes by, and that therefore, you know, if you see things like, you know, on Instagram, someone's like, well, that's gonna, you know, catch you, it's gonna come back to you 3 times, or what about the threefold law, or hard none, you know, like, what about the Wiccan read? Understand that it doesn't apply to everyone, not even Wiccans, and understand where it came from, that, you know, traditionally speaking, it might not have even been that big of a thing. It was a poem mostly attributed to Doreen Valiente, and I guess I personally, for example, I do feel like the Wiccan read holds truth, and I feel like it's a good kind of moral compass to, like, align yourself with, but I'm not super strict about it. Like, I will work baneful magic if I have to, not even if I have to, if I want to. So, you know, I feel like it's just one of those things. You have to have your own kind of moral code or code of ethics, and to be aware of that the Wiccan read might not work for you or for everyone, and just keep that in mind. It's also really important that a lot of that kind of harm none, you know, talk really came around with the Satanic Panic, in which, you know, everyone tried to really kind of distance themselves away from anything relating to baneful workings, because it was such a stereotype and there were a lot of issues. Research the Satanic Panic if you don't know what I'm talking about. And that really was pushed, you know. A lot of the books that were written in the 90s and early 2000s really pushed that. There is no, you know, devil in witchcraft or in Wicca. There is no harm in Wicca, and it really kind of relates back to that. So research that. It's a great thing to, you know, to have in your arsenal of knowledge, especially when people kind of talk shit about Wicca, because then you can say, well, actually, that's not how it actually is. So yeah, those are my 10 tips for Wicca. I'll give you one extra bonus tip. A lot of people, when they get into Wicca, they think they have to buy all the tools, all the themes and statues, and they need to get the most beautiful Book of Shadows, and, you know, bells and chalices and cups and whatnot, right? Don't get too caught up in materialistic things within Wicca or witchcraft in general. You can't buy yourself, you can't buy your way into Wicca. You can't buy your way into witchcraft in general. The only thing that will advance you on this path in this religion is practice. Definitely keep that in mind. The materialistic side of it is, it's beautiful and I love it. Clearly I love it, but, you know, I've been practicing for 13 years now. It accumulates over time, so don't worry about it. You know, you can have everything DIY. You can completely just, it doesn't necessarily have to be just that materialistic, essentially, right? So don't worry about it if you can't buy or afford all these fancy things. You don't ever have to. So those were my, I guess, 11 tips for you if you are a beginner Wiccan, if you're interested in Wicca and you are maybe just curious. So yeah, that was it really for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Now I do have a Patreon if you would like to support me. That's one of the best ways that you can do so. There is an exclusive Discord chat as well. So yeah, I'll leave that in the description box for you. And of course, a more traditional way of supporting me would be to give this video a like, a subscribe, and hit that notification bell. And yeah, thank you so much. If you have any questions, comments, or video suggestions, leave them in the description. Leave them in the chat down below, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you so much. Blessed be. Bye.